Have you ever found yourself trapped in a nightmare so vivid, so terrifying, that even when you wake up, the lingering dread follows you into the daylight? My name is Caden Thorne, and as a psychiatrist who has spent years delving into the darkest recesses of the human mind, I thought I'd seen it all. I believed that every fear, every horror, could be rationalized, categorized, and understood. But nothing in my training, nothing in my years of experience, could have prepared me for the nightmare that clawed its way into my reality. This isn't just a story, it's a warning, because what began as a dream has become an inescapable part of my existence. A shadow that haunts my every step, a presence that lingers in the corners of my vision, just out of reach, but always there. It was an ordinary night when it all started, or at least it seemed so. But as I drifted off to sleep, the boundaries between what was real and what was imagined began to blur in the most horrifying way. The dream was unlike any I'd ever experienced. It was vivid, tangible, and terrifyingly immersive. I found myself standing before the entrance of an abandoned psychiatric hospital, its towering facade looming over me like a decaying monolith from a forgotten time. The walls were cracked and weathered, the windows shattered, their jagged edges resembling teeth, ready to devour anyone foolish enough to venture inside. But I wasn't just any fool. I was compelled, drawn into this place by an unseen force that whispered my name in the wind. As I stood there, staring at the gaping maw of the entrance, a deep sense of unease settled over me, like a heavy blanket of dread that I couldn't shake off. The air was thick, suffocating, filled with the acrid scent of mildew and rot. And underneath it all, something else, something foul, metallic, like the scent of blood long dried but never forgotten. Before I continue, I urge you, if you're still with me, subscribe to this channel and like this video. Because the stories I share are not for the faint of heart. They are for those brave enough to confront the shadows, to explore the darkness that lies just beyond the edge of the light. If you think you're ready, if you believe you can handle the truth, then stay with me. But be warned, once you enter this world, there's no turning back. It was supposed to be just another night, another fleeting escape into the recesses of my subconscious. But this dream, it was different, far more sinister. It began like any other, with the comforting familiarity of slipping into the arms of sleep. But as my mind drifted, I found myself standing in front of that abandoned psychiatric hospital, its presence oppressive and unyielding. The air around me was heavy with a palpable sense of dread, and the building itself seemed to breathe, its decaying walls exhaling a cold, damp mist that clung to my skin like the fingers of the dead. The hospital loomed over me, a colossal structure of stone and shadow, each cracked window an eye that had seen too much. Every door a mouth that had swallowed secrets and refused to let them go. As I hesitated on the threshold, a shiver ran down my spine. The entrance beckoned me, but it wasn't just an invitation. It was a demand, one that I couldn't refuse, no matter how much every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The darkness within was thick, almost tangible, as if the very air inside had been tainted by the horrors it had witnessed. I stepped inside, and immediately, the world outside seemed to vanish. The silence was absolute, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that weighed heavily on your chest, the kind that made you hyper-aware of every breath, every heartbeat. The only sound was the faint echo of my footsteps, each one resonating through the desolate halls like the tolling of a distant bell. The floor beneath my feet felt uneven, and every step was met with a soft crunch, as if I were walking on bones hidden just beneath the surface. The deeper I ventured, the more unsettling the environment became. The air was thick with the stench of decay and something else, something that made my stomach churn. The unmistakable scent of burning flesh, lingering as if the fires had only recently been extinguished. The walls were stained with mold and something darker, something that glistened under the dim light filtering through the cracked windows. It was a place where the very walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the inevitable. And then there was the sound, a low, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a vibration in the air that sent chills racing down my spine. It was as if the building was alive, its very structure pulsing with the echoes of the past, with the memories of those who had once walked its halls and never left. The whisper was unintelligible, but it carried a weight, a sorrow so profound that it was almost suffocating. I couldn't understand the words, but the intent was clear. I was not welcome here, but it was too late to turn back. Something was drawing me deeper into the hospital, guiding me through the labyrinthine corridors that twisted and turned in ways that defied logic. Every corner I turned brought a new horror, a fleeting shadow that danced just out of sight, a distant scream that echoed through the halls only to be swallowed by the oppressive silence. And then, as I reached what seemed to be the heart of the building, the dream became something else entirely. The air grew colder, and the darkness thickened around me, pressing in from all sides. My breath came in shallow gasps, each one visible in the freezing air. A door loomed ahead, slightly ajar, with a faint, sickly yellow light spilling out from within. The light flickered, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to writhe and contort as if they were alive. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the door, the whispering growing louder, more insistent. As I pushed the door open, the scent hit me first, a thick, nauseating smell of blood, sweat, and something far worse. Inside, the room was small, almost claustrophobic, with walls lined with rusted metal and peeling paint. In the center, a single ancient gurney stood under a flickering light, its once white sheets stained dark with old blood. Strapped to it was something, a figure, its form indistinguishable, beneath the stained sheets. But its presence was undeniable. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness, filled with an unspeakable hunger. That was when I realized this wasn't just a dream. It was a memory, a twisted echo of something that had happened long ago, and yet it felt more real than anything I had ever experienced. The figure on the gurney began to stir, and as it did, the air grew thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. I tried to move, to run, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the floor. The whispering was now a roar, filling my mind with a single terrifying truth. I was not alone, and whatever was in that room with me was not bound by the same rules of reality. This was no ordinary nightmare. It was a warning, a message from a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead, between reality and dream, had long since dissolved. And as I stood there, paralyzed by fear, I knew that waking up wouldn't free me from what was coming. The true horror had only just begun. As I ventured further into the hospital's decaying depths, a sense of unease began to seep into my bones, a feeling that something was profoundly wrong. The oppressive silence that surrounded me was broken only by the echo of my footsteps, each one reverberating down the long, dark corridors like a sinister countdown to some unknown fate. The walls, once sterile and white, were now smeared with grime and something darker, something that had long since dried but still held the unmistakable color of blood. The air was thick with the scent of rot, as if the very building was decomposing around me, and yet I couldn't turn back. Something was compelling me forward, pulling me deeper into the heart of the hospital. The flickering lights overhead cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to twist and contort as I passed, as though they were lying, writhing in some silent agony. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of stale air felt like the breath of some unseen entity, watching me from the shadows. And then there were the whispers, soft, barely audible, but persistent, as if the walls themselves were trying to communicate with me. They were just out of reach, too faint to make out the words, but their intent was clear. I was being warned, but I didn't know from what. As I moved through the halls, I began to notice that things were shifting around me. Objects that should have been stationary seemed to move when I wasn't looking. A rusted wheelchair that had been in one corner of the hallway was suddenly in another, its wheels creaking softly as it settled into place. A broken mirror that had been lying shattered on the floor now stood upright against the wall, its cracked surface reflecting something that wasn't there. It was as if the hospital itself was playing tricks on me, distorting reality in subtle, terrifying ways. Then there were the shadows. They seemed to have a life of their own, slithering along the walls and floor like black tendrils reaching out for something. Or shaman. At times, I could swear I saw them move in my peripheral vision, darting out of sight the moment I turned my head. The more I tried to ignore them, the more aggressive they became, stretching across the floor towards me, their edges jagged and sharp like claws. It felt as though the darkness was trying to pull me in, to swallow me whole. And the more I resisted, the stronger it became. The most disturbing thing of all, however, was the sensation of being watched. It wasn't just the feeling of eyes on my back. This was something far more invasive, something that made my skin crawl and my heart race. It was as if the hospital itself was alive, sentient, and it was focusing all of its attention on me. I could feel it in the air, a heavy, oppressive presence that seemed to press down on me from all sides, suffocating me with its intensity. The closer I got to the center of the building, the more palpable this presence became, until it was almost unbearable. At one point, I turned a corner and found myself facing a door that hadn't been there before. It was old, wooden, and slightly ajar, with a faint, pulsating light emanating from within. The light was sickly and yellow, casting eerie shadows on the walls that seemed to twist and writhe like tortured souls. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, the wood cold and damp to the touch. The moment my fingers brushed against it, the whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if urging me to enter. Despite every instinct telling me to turn back, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small, claustrophobic, with walls that seemed to close in on me as I entered. The source of the light was a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, flickering sporadically as if it were on the verge of burning out. The shadows in the room were thicker, darker, and they clung to the corners like living things, watching me with malevolent intent. In the center of the room was a small table, and on it, something that made my blood run cold, a dusty old photograph, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. I approached the table, my heart pounding in my chest, and picked up the photograph with trembling hands. It was a picture of a man standing in front of the very hospital I was now trapped in. He was dressed in a doctor's coat, his face expressionless, but his eyes were filled with a darkness so profound, so empty, that I felt as though I were staring into the abyss itself. And then I realized something that made my breath catch in my throat. The man in the photograph was me. I stumbled back, dropping the photograph as if it had burned me, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. The whispers in the walls had become a cacophony, 1,000 voices all speaking at once, their words incomprehensible, but filled with anger, with fear. The shadows began to move, coalescing into shapes, forms that resembled human figures but were twisted, distorted, as if they were trapped in some horrific nightmare. They reached out towards me, their hands stretching impossibly long, their fingers curling like claws. Panic surged through me, and I turned to flee. But the door I had entered through was gone, replaced by a solid wall. I was trapped, the shadows closing in, the whispering voices growing louder, more desperate. In a final, desperate act, I turned back to the table, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. But the table was empty. The photograph was gone, as if it had never existed. That's when I heard it, the sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a low, guttural growl coming from the shadows, a sound that no human throat could produce. It was filled with hatred, with malice, and it was coming closer. The shadows parted, revealing a figure standing in the corner of the room, its form hidden in darkness, but its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It stared at me, unblinking, as if it were deciding what to do with me, and in that moment I knew I was not meant to leave this place alive. The room began to spin, the walls closing in, the shadows reaching out to drag me into their depths. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, but the sense of dread remained. The clock on my nightstand read 3:33 a.m., the same time I had seen in the dream. But this was no ordinary dream. It was something else, something that had followed me from the depths of my subconscious into the waking world. And I knew, deep down, that whatever it wasn't finished with me yet. The nightmare was just beginning. The moment I stepped into that small, suffocating room, everything changed. The oppressive air, the relentless whispers, the unsettling shadows, they all coalesced into something far more terrifying. In the center of the room stood a rusted, ancient gurney, its metal frame stained with the memories of countless tormented souls. It was an object of unspeakable horror, a relic from a time when the line between treatment and torture was blurred beyond recognition. The very sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, but I was drawn to it, compelled by an unseen force to move closer, to uncover the truth that lay hidden within its rusted confines. As I approached the gurney, the flickering light overhead dimmed, casting the room in a murky, almost sepulchral glow. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the very walls were trying to warn me, to turn me away from the horror I was about to unleash. But it was too late. My hand, trembling and cold, reached out to touch the gurney, and the moment my fingers made contact, a violent shock of cold surged through my body, as if I had just touched the icy hand of death itself. And then the room itself seemed to breathe, its walls pulsing, its shadows writhing as if they were alive. The gurney began to tremble, and before my horrified eyes, a figure started to materialize on it, slowly, painfully, as if being dragged from the depths of some nightmarish abyss. It was a woman, or at least what was left of one. Her body was gaunt, her skin stretched tight over her bones, her eyes hollow and sunken, filled with an agony so profound that it seemed to seep into the very air around her. She was strapped to the gurney, her wrists and ankles bound by leather restraints that had long since fused with her decaying flesh. For a moment, I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by the sheer horror of what I was witnessing. She began to thrash weakly against her restraints, her mouth opening in a silent scream that sent a wave of cold terror through me. It was then that I noticed something far more chilling. Her eyes, though empty and lifeless, were locked onto mine. She wasn't just looking at me, she was pleading with me, begging for something I couldn't comprehend, something that transcended the limits of life and death. Suddenly the room was filled with a low, guttural sound, a growl that resonated through the walls, vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. The figure on the gurney convulsed violently, her body arching off the metal frame, as if some unseen force was trying to tear her apart. The air grew thick with the stench of burning flesh, and the light flickered wildly, casting distorted shadows that seemed to dance in grotesque patterns on the walls. In a moment of sheer panic, I tried to back away, but the door had vanished, replaced by a solid wall. I was trapped, the shadows closing in around me, their forms shifting and twisting into ghastly shapes that defied logic and reason. The woman's convulsions grew more violent, her silent screams more desperate until, with a final shuddering breath, she fell still. The growling intensified, filling the room with a deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. And then, as I stood there, frozen in terror, the woman's eyes snapped open. They were no longer hollow, no longer filled with pain. They were black, endless pits of darkness, void of any humanity, and they were locked onto mine with an intensity that burned into my soul. The room plunged into darkness, the light overhead finally giving out, leaving me in complete and utter blackness. I couldn't see, but I could feel the presence of something far more sinister than the woman on the gurney. It was in the room with me, circling me, its breath hot and fetid against my skin, its growls low and menacing. And then, out of the darkness, a voice, cold, harsh, and inhuman, whispered my name. My heart raced as I turned frantically, trying to find the source of the voice, but all I could see were the shifting shadows, closing in on me, suffocating me. The voice spoke again, this time louder, more insistent, and the words it spoke chilled me to the core. "You are mine now." At that moment, the darkness seemed to come alive, swirling around me like a living entity, wrapping me in its icy embrace. The woman on the gurney began to move again, her body twisting and contorting in unnatural ways, her black eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I could feel the presence behind me, its cold breath on the back of my neck, its claws grazing my skin, and I knew that if I didn't do something, if I didn't escape, I would be lost to the darkness forever. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I shut my eyes and forced myself to remember. This was just a dream. It had to be a dream, but the terror was too real, the sensations too vivid. I could feel the cold metal of the gurney under my hand, the oppressive weight of the darkness around me, the malevolent presence that was now so close I could feel its icy fingers digging into my flesh. In a final act of desperation, I screamed, loud, raw, primal, a sound that tore through the silence, echoing through the darkness. And then, as if by some miracle, the world shifted. The darkness receded, the cold claws released their grip, and I was suddenly, inexplicably, back in my bedroom. I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The room was dark, but I could see the faint outline of familiar objects. The nightstand, the clock, the door to my bathroom. But something was wrong. The clock's numbers glowed eerily in the darkness, reading 3:33 a.m., the same time it had been in the dream. And then I heard it, the growl, low and menacing, coming from the corner of the room. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned to face the source of the sound, my mind racing with the impossible reality that the nightmare hadn't ended. It had followed me, breached the barrier between dream and waking life. And now, it was here in my room, with me. The figure from the dream stood in the corner, shrouded in shadow, its eyes, those same black, soulless eyes, gleaming in the darkness. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was no longer safe. The nightmare had become reality, and there was no waking up from this. The days that followed were a blur of unease and sleepless nights. The dream, or whatever it was, had burrowed into my mind, replaying itself in fragments whenever I closed my eyes. But it wasn't just the memories of the dream that haunted me. Something had changed. Something had followed me back from that hellish place. The air in my apartment felt heavier, the shadows darker, more oppressive, as if they were waiting for something. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see those black, soulless eyes staring back at me. But the worst part was the gnawing feeling that the nightmare wasn't over, that it was only the beginning of something much more sinister. Unable to shake the lingering dread, I began to research the old psychiatric hospital. I spent hours scouring the internet, poring over old articles, archives, anything that might explain what I had experienced. What I found was a series of reports that chilled me to the bone. The hospital had been operational in the early 1900s, a place where the most disturbed and dangerous patients were sent, often never to return. The stories of what went on inside those walls were the stuff of nightmares. Experimental treatments, torture disguised as therapy, and patients who simply disappeared, their records erased as if they had never existed. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that my dream wasn't just a figment of my imagination. The details were too specific, too real. The rusted gurney, the suffocating darkness, even the whispering voices. Everything matched the descriptions in the old reports. But it was when I came across the accounts of the hospital's closure that the true horror of my situation began to unfold. According to the records, the hospital was shut down after a particularly gruesome incident. A doctor, known only by his last name, Thorne, had been conducting illegal experiments on his patients, pushing them to the brink of death and beyond. It was said that his methods were so extreme, so inhumane, that even the other staff members refused to speak of them. My blood ran cold, as I read that name, Thorn, the same name as mine. It was too much of a coincidence to ignore. I felt a chill run down my spine, as if a cold hand had reached out from the past to touch me. Could this be the reason why I'd been drawn to that place in my dream? Was there some connection between me and this doctor? Some dark legacy that I had unwittingly inherited? I needed answers, but I wasn't sure where to find them. My search led me to the town where the hospital once stood, a forgotten place that seemed frozen in time. The locals were tight-lipped, their faces pale and drawn when I mentioned the hospital. It was as if the entire town was living in the shadow of that place, unwilling or unable to escape its dark history. But there was one person, an old man who had been a child when the hospital was still operational, who agreed to speak with me. We met in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of town. The man's hands trembled as he spoke, his voice a raspy whisper that barely rose above the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. He told me about the nightmares that had plagued the town since the hospital closed, about the strange occurrences that continued to happen long after the last patient had been transferred. People would disappear, he said, vanishing without a trace, only to be found days later, wandering the streets with no memory of where they had been. Others claimed to see shadows moving in the windows of the abandoned hospital and hear voices calling to them in the dead of night. But it was what he said next that truly terrified me. He mentioned a journal, a record kept by Dr. Thorne himself, detailing his experiments and the results. The journal, the old man said, had been lost for years, but rumors persisted that it still existed, hidden somewhere in the ruins of the hospital. And according to legend, anyone who found it would uncover the true nature of the horrors that had taken place there, but at a terrible cost. I left the diner with a sense of foreboding, the old man's words echoing in my mind. The idea of a journal filled with the darkest secrets of a madman was horrifying, but at the same time, I felt a pull, an irresistible urge to find it. I knew that the answers I sought were there, buried in the ashes of the past. But the thought of returning to that place, of confronting whatever darkness still lingered there, filled me with dread. Back at my apartment, the unease only grew. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking, and I could still hear the faint echo of the whispering voices in the dead of night. I felt as if I was being watched, as if something had crossed over from the dream into my waking life. The clock on my nightstand would stop at 3:33 a.m. every night, the same time I had seen in the dream, and no matter how many times I reset it, it would freeze again, as if mocking me. The final straw came when I discovered a strange symbol etched into the wood of my bedroom door, a symbol I had seen in my dream, in the darkness of that cursed room. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but its presence was undeniable. My breath caught in my throat as I traced it with my fingers, the wood cold to the touch. I knew then that there was no escaping this. Whatever I had stumbled upon, whatever dark connection I had to that place, it was coming for me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had to go back. I had to return to the hospital, find the journal, and uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. Because the nightmare wasn't going to end on its own. It had followed me back into the real world, and it wouldn't stop until it had consumed me completely. I was caught in a web of horror and mystery that stretched back generations, and the only way out was to face the darkness head-on, to confront the shadow of Dr. Thorne and the legacy he had left behind. The drive to the abandoned psychiatric hospital was a journey through a landscape that seemed to grow more desolate with every passing mile. The sky was a dull, oppressive gray, the kind that drains the color from the world, leaving everything looking lifeless and cold. The trees along the road were skeletal, their bare branches reaching out like the twisted fingers of the damned, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if the very earth itself was warning me to turn back. But there was no turning back. I was being pulled towards that place, as if by an invisible thread, and I knew that I had to see this through, no matter the cost. When I finally arrived, the sight of the hospital sent a shiver down my spine. It stood like a monolith of despair, its crumbling facade looming over the surrounding landscape. The windows were black voids, staring out like the hollow eyes of a corpse, and the building itself seemed to exude a malevolent presence, as if it were alive, waiting for me to step inside. The wind howled through the empty halls, carrying with it the faint echoes of the past, distant screams, whispers of forgotten souls, and the cold, hollow laughter of the mad. As I stepped out of the car, I felt the weight of the place settle over me like a suffocating blanket. The air was thick with the stench of decay and something else. Something I couldn't quite place, but that made my skin crawl. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from that cursed place as possible. But I couldn't. The pull was too strong. The need for answers too great. With a deep breath, I steeled myself and began to walk towards the entrance. The doors groaned in protest as I pushed them open, the sound reverberating through the empty halls like the moan of a dying man. Inside, the air was even colder, the shadows deeper, as if the building itself was trying to consume all light, all hope. The walls were covered in mold and grime, the floor littered with debris, broken glass, rusted metal, and something that looked disturbingly like dried blood. But it was the silence that unnerved me the most. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, the kind that presses down on you from all sides, filling your ears with the pounding of your own heart. As I ventured deeper into the hospital, the sense of being watched became almost unbearable. The shadows seemed to move just at the edge of my vision, and every now and then I caught a glimpse of something, an indistinct figure, a fleeting movement, just out of the corner of my eye. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. The corridors twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, leading me deeper into the bowels of the building, as if the hospital itself was guiding me, pulling me towards some inevitable conclusion. And then I found him. He was sitting in a small, dimly lit room, the only source of light a single flickering bulb that cast long, distorted shadows across the walls. He was an old man, his face gaunt and lined with age, his eyes hollow and sunken, filled with a fear so profound that it seemed to radiate from him in waves. His clothes were tattered and stained, as if he had been wearing them for years, and his hands trembled as he clutched a small, leather-bound book to his chest. The journal. Our eyes met, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he began to speak, his voice a raspy whisper that barely rose above the oppressive silence. He told me that he had been drawn to the hospital, just as I had, unable to resist the pull of the place. He had found the journal hidden in the ruins, and with it he had uncovered the truth, the horrifying truth about Dr. Thorne and the experiments he had conducted in the name of science. The journal detailed every unspeakable act, every twisted experiment, and it was clear that Dr. Thorne had been obsessed with the idea of transcending death, of finding a way to cheat the grave. But it wasn't just the journal that had kept the old man here. There was something else, something far more terrifying. He had seen things in the hospital, things that shouldn't exist, things that defied all reason and logic. He spoke of shadows that moved on their own, of voices that whispered in the dark, of figures that appeared and disappeared in the blink of an eye. And then he spoke of the patients, those poor souls who had been subjected to Thorne's experiments. They were still here, he said, trapped between life and death, their souls bound to the hospital by the horrors they had endured. As he spoke, I felt a chill run down my spine, a cold, creeping dread that settled deep in my bones. I knew that he was telling the truth. I could feel it in the air, in the oppressive atmosphere of the hospital, in the way the shadows seemed to close in around us. The old man's voice trembled as he told me that he had tried to leave, but every time he did, he was drawn back, as if the hospital wouldn't let him go. And now, it was happening to me. He handed me the journal, his hands shaking so badly that I had to take it from him to keep it from falling. As soon as I touched it, I felt a surge of cold, as if the very book itself was alive, pulsing with the malevolent energy of the hospital. The old man's eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I saw the truth. The hospital wasn't just a building. It was a living entity, a malevolent force that fed on the souls of those who entered its walls, trapping them in an endless cycle of terror and despair. I knew then that there was no escape. The hospital had claimed me, just as it had claimed the old man, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to know the truth. I had to understand what had happened in this place and why it had chosen me. The old man's voice broke through my thoughts, his tone desperate and filled with a terror that mirrored my own. He told me that the only way to end it, the only way to escape, was to confront the darkness, to face whatever horrors awaited me in the depths of the hospital. As he spoke, I felt the shadows closing in around us, their presence heavy and suffocating. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. I knew the time was running out, that if I didn't act soon, I would be lost to the darkness forever. But there was still one thing I needed to do. One final act of defiance against the malevolent force that had claimed so many lives. I looked at the old man, and in his eyes I saw a reflection of my own fear, my own desperation. But I also saw something else. Hope. The faintest glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could break free from this nightmare, that we could end the cycle of terror and despair that had consumed so many before us. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. The journal felt heavy in my hands, its pages filled with the darkest secrets of a madman, but it also felt like a key that could unlock the truth, that could set us free. I knew that the path ahead would be filled with horrors beyond my imagination, that the hospital would do everything in its power to stop me. But I also knew that I couldn't turn back, that I couldn't let the darkness win. With a final nod to the old man, I turned and began to walk deeper into the hospital. The journal clutched tightly in my hand. The air grew colder with every step, the shadows darker, more oppressive. The whispers became a cacophony, filling my mind with their insistent, maddening voices. But I pressed on, driven by the need for answers, by the hope that somewhere in the depths of this cursed place, I would find the truth. The old man's voice echoed in my mind as I descended into the heart of the hospital. His final words a chilling reminder of the horror that awaited me. Once you enter the darkness, there's no turning back. And as the shadows closed in around me, I knew that I had crossed the threshold, that I was no longer just a visitor in this nightmare. I was a part of it, bound to the hospital by the same malevolent force that had claimed so many before me. And whatever awaited me in the depths of the hospital, I knew it was watching, waiting, and it would stop at nothing to consume me. The descent into the heart of the hospital felt like a journey into the very depths of hell. Each step I took seemed to echo endlessly in the cold, dark corridors, the sound bouncing off the walls and disappearing into the black void that stretched out before me. The air was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, a palpable darkness that pressed in on me from all sides. Suffocating, oppressive. The whispers had grown louder, more frantic, as if the very walls were alive, screaming in agony, warning me to turn back. But I couldn't stop. The journal in my hand felt like a lead weight, dragging me deeper into the abyss, pulling me towards whatever dark secret lay hidden at the center of this nightmare. The further I went, the more twisted the hospital became. The walls seemed to close in on me, the corridors narrowing until I was almost squeezing through, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The lights flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance and writhe like living things. And then there were the sounds, faint at first, barely audible above the pounding of my heart, but growing louder, more distinct as I moved deeper into the building. They were the sounds of footsteps, dragging, shuffling, moving just out of sight. The sounds of something, or someone, lurking in the darkness, following me. My hands trembled as I held the journal, its pages filled with the ramblings of a madman. Dr. Thorne's writing was erratic, the words scrawled in a frantic, desperate hand, as if he had been driven to the brink of insanity by the horrors he had unleashed. The experiments he described were beyond anything I could have imagined. Procedures designed to push the boundaries of life and death, to explore the very essence of the human soul. But it was the last entries that filled me with a cold, creeping terror. They spoke of a presence, a darkness that had been awakened by his experiments, something that had been lying dormant within the hospital waiting to be set free. And now that darkness was awake, I reached the end of the corridor and found myself standing before a massive rusted door, its surface marred with deep scratches, as if something had tried to claw its way out. The door seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a cold, malevolent force that made my skin crawl. I could feel it seeping into me, a creeping dread that whispered of death, of pain, of something far worse than either. My hand shook as I reached for the door, the metal cold and slick under my fingers. For a moment I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to run, to escape while I still could. But I couldn't. I had come too far. The truth was just beyond this door, and I had to know, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The room beyond was vast, far larger than I had expected, its walls lined with rows upon rows of metal shelves, each one filled with jars, vials, and strange, unidentifiable objects. The air was thick with the stench of chemicals, of rot and decay, and something else, something far more disturbing. The shadows in the room seemed to cling to the walls, swirling and shifting as if alive, watching me with a malevolent intent. At the center of the room was a large surgical table, its surface stained dark with old blood, and above it a series of rusted, archaic instruments hung from the ceiling, their edges gleaming in the dim light. But it was what lay on the table that sent a shiver of pure terror through me. A figure draped in a filthy, tattered sheet lay motionless on the table. The sheet was stained, soaked through with something dark and viscous, and as I stepped closer, I could see that it wasn't just blood. It was something else, something that seemed to pulse and writhe under the surface, as if alive. My breath caught in my throat as I reached out to pull back the sheet, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind screaming at me to stop, to turn away. But I couldn't. I had to know. As I pulled back the sheet, the figure on the table came into view, and the sight of it nearly drove me to my knees. It was the woman from my dream, her body twisted and contorted, her skin stretched tight over her bones, her eyes black and empty, staring up at me with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. But there was something else, something far worse. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, and from it a thick black ichor was oozing out, dripping down her chin, pooling on the table. The smell was overwhelming, a sickly sweet stench that made my stomach turn, and I could feel the bile rising in my throat. But before I could react, before I could turn and flee, her eyes snapped to mine. In that instant, I felt a cold, icy hand close around my heart, squeezing it with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. The room seemed to spin around me, the walls closing in, the shadows reaching out, trying to drag me down into the darkness. The woman's mouth moved, her lips forming words that I couldn't hear, but that I could feel deep in my soul. They were words of pain, of suffering, of a terror so profound that it defied comprehension. And then, in a voice that was not hers, but something far darker, something far older, she spoke. "You should not have come here." The shadows surged forward, swallowing the light, plunging the room into darkness. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, pulling me back, away from the table, away from the horror that lay upon it. I turned, expecting to see the old man, or perhaps some other lost soul, trapped within the hospital. But there was nothing. Just darkness, just the cold, suffocating embrace of the shadows. And then, from the darkness, something began to rise. It was a figure, tall and gaunt, its form shrouded in shadow, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if it were not bound by the same laws of physics that governed the rest of the world. As it approached, the air grew colder, the shadows deepening, thickening, until it felt like I was drowning in them. The figure reached out, its hand, no, its claw, stretching towards me, its touch icy, its presence overwhelming. In that moment, I knew that this was it. This was the darkness that had been awakened by Dr. Thorne's experiments, the malevolent force that had been waiting, lurking, feeding on the fear and pain of those who had been trapped within the hospital's walls. And now, it had come for me. The journal slipped from my grasp, falling to the floor with a dull thud. The figure paused, its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I felt a wave of despair wash over me. I had failed. I had come here seeking answers, seeking the truth, but all I had found was death, pain, and a darkness that was beyond anything I could have imagined. But then, as the figure loomed over me, as the shadows closed in, I remembered the old man's words. Once you enter the darkness, there's no turning back. He had been right. There was no turning back. But there was still one thing I could do. One final act of defiance. With a sudden surge of determination, I reached down, grabbing the journal from the floor. The figure recoiled, its eyes narrowing, its form flickering as if caught in a strong wind. The shadows around me seemed to hesitate, as if unsure of what to do. And in that moment, I knew that I had found the key. The journal. It was the key to ending this, to breaking the cycle of terror that had claimed so many lives. But the darkness was not going to let me go easily. The figure lunged forward, its clawed hand reaching for me, its eyes blazing with a fury that shook me to my core. The shadows surged forward, enveloping me in their cold embrace, pulling me down into the abyss. I fought, struggled, but it was like trying to swim against a riptide. Futile, impossible. The darkness was too strong, too powerful. It was going to consume me, just as it had consumed all those before me. But I wasn't going to go down without a fight. With a final, desperate burst of strength, I opened the journal, flipping to the last page. The words were scrawled in a frantic hand, barely legible, but I could feel their power, their significance. They were the last words of Dr. Thorne, a final plea for forgiveness, for redemption. And in that moment, I understood. The journal wasn't just a record of his experiments. It was a confession, a way to atone for the horrors he had unleashed. And it was my way out. With a trembling hand, I began to read the words aloud, my voice echoing through the darkness. The figure froze, its eyes wide, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. The shadows recoiled, pulling back, retreating as if burned by an unseen light. The air grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting, and I could feel the darkness losing its grip on me. But I wasn't free yet. The figure let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes narrowing to slits as it lunged at me, its claws outstretched. But it was too late. The words were out, the confession complete, and with a final deafening roar, the darkness exploded, the shadows evaporating like mist in the morning sun. The figure shrieked, its form dissolving into nothingness, and in that moment, I knew that I had won. The room was silent, the air still. The darkness was gone, the shadows no more than free smuds on the walls. The journal lay open in my hands, its pages blank, the words gone, as if they had never existed. I was alone, standing in the heart of the hospital, the truth finally revealed. But as I turned to leave, I felt a chill run down my spine. The darkness was gone, but the hospital was still there. Its walls still whispering, its shadows still watching. And as I stepped through the door, back into the cold, gray light of day, I knew that the nightmare wasn't over. The darkness was gone, but it wasn't defeated. It was waiting, biding its time, and one day it would return. And when it did, I would be ready. The hospital may have been left behind, but its darkness clung to me, a shadow that refused to let go. As I drove away, the sun barely piercing through the thick gray clouds above, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a reminder that what I had faced in those cursed halls wasn't finished with me, not by a long shot. The world outside my window seemed distorted, twisted, as if viewed through a warped lens. The trees, bare and lifeless, loomed over the road like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches stretching out like skeletal fingers, reaching for me. I arrived home, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. The air inside was heavy, suffocating, and the walls seemed to close in on me the moment I stepped through the door. I could feel the presence I had encountered in the hospital lingering just beyond the edges of my perception. Watching. Waiting. The journal, now nothing more than a collection of blank pages, lay on my desk, a constant reminder of the horrors I had uncovered. But even without the words, I could feel the weight of its contents pressing down on me, as if the very essence of the darkness had seeped into its pages, into my life. The first night back was the worst. I lay in bed, the darkness around me thick and impenetrable, the silence broken only by the sound of my own breathing. But it wasn't just the darkness that suffocated me. It was the feeling of being watched. My skin prickled and my breath hitched in my throat as I strained to hear something, anything that might explain the dread that gnawed at my insides. The clock on the nightstand ticked away, the minutes dragging into hours, each second marked by the relentless pounding of my heart. And then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., I heard it. The same low, guttural growl that had haunted my dreams, now echoing through the shadows of my room. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. Every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for whatever was lurking in the darkness to reveal itself. The growl grew louder, closer, until it felt as though it was right next to my ear, a hot, fetid breath brushing against my skin. But when I turned, there was nothing. Only the suffocating darkness, the oppressive silence. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the horrors I had faced were behind me, locked away in that decaying hospital. But deep down, I knew the truth. The darkness had followed me home. It was here, in my house, in my room, in my mind. And it wasn't going to leave until it had finished what it started. The growl came again, this time from the foot of the bed, low and menacing, reverberating through the room like a predator's warning before the kill. I bolted upright, my eyes scanning the darkness. But there was nothing, just the deep, impenetrable blackness that seemed to swallow the light from the small lamp beside me. The growl faded, but the sense of dread only grew stronger, pressing down on me with an almost physical force. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flash of movement, a shadow darting across the room, too quick to be fully seen, but unmistakable in its intent. Something was here with me. I threw off the covers, my heart racing, and reached for the lamp. The light flickered to life, casting weak, trembling shadows across the room, but it offered no comfort. The presence was still there, lurking just beyond the edges of the light, waiting for the darkness to return. I could feel it, a cold, malevolent force that filled the room, watching me with those same black, soulless eyes that had haunted my dreams. Sleep was impossible after that. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of the room, the lamp clutched in my hand like a lifeline, my eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. The growls continued, coming from different corners of the room, each one sending a fresh wave of terror through me. But no matter how much I searched, I could never find the source. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, a living, breathing entity that had wrapped itself around me, feeding on my fear. When morning finally came, it brought no relief. The light of day felt cold and artificial, unable to penetrate the deep-rooted darkness that had settled over my life. Every sound, every movement, seemed amplified, twisted, as if the world around me was just a veneer, hiding the true horror that lurked beneath. The journal remained on the desk, its blank pages taunting me, daring me to open it again, to plunge back into the nightmare that had consumed my life. But I couldn't bring myself to touch it, not yet. Not when I could still feel the darkness watching, waiting. As the days passed, the presence became more insistent. Shadows stretched longer than they should. The air grew colder, and the growls grew louder, more frequent. I began to see things, flashes of movement in the corners of my vision, figures that disappeared when I turned to look. The whispering returned, filling my mind with a cacophony of voices that spoke in tongues I couldn't understand, but whose intent was clear. I wasn't alone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows began to lengthen, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this, trapped in fear, constantly looking over my shoulder. If the darkness was going to consume me, I had to face it on my terms. I retrieved the journal, its pages still blank, and began to write. I wrote everything I'd experienced, every horror, every fear, every detail of the nightmare that had taken over my life. The act of writing was cathartic, a way to confront the darkness, to give it form, to understand it. But as I wrote, something strange happened. The shadows in the room began to move, to coalesce around me, tightening their grip. The growls grew louder, more insistent, and the whispering became a roar, filling my mind with 1,000 voices, all screaming in unison. The room grew colder, the light from the lamp dimming until it was barely a flicker, and I could feel the darkness pressing in on me, closing in for the kill. But I didn't stop writing. I couldn't. The words flowed from me in a torrent, filling the pages of the journal with a desperate energy, as if the act of writing itself was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. The figures in the shadows became clearer, more defined, twisted, grotesque forms that hovered just out of reach, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. They were the remnants of the hospital, the souls that had been trapped there, twisted by Dr. Thorne's experiments, by the darkness that had taken over. And then, with a final desperate stroke of the pen, I finished. The journal was filled, the last page covered in my frantic scrawl, and the moment I set the pen down, the room fell silent. The growls stopped, the whispering ceased, and the shadows receded, retreating to the corners of the room, their presence still there, but muted, as if they were waiting, watching. For a moment, I sat in stunned silence, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness had pulled back, but it wasn't gone. I could feel it, lingering just beyond the edges of the light, biding its time. The journal sat on the desk before me, its pages filled with the horrors I had faced, but I knew that it wasn't over. The darkness had been pushed back, but it hadn't been defeated. It was still there, still waiting, still hungry. And then, as if to confirm my worst fears, the clock on the nightstand clicked over to 3:33 a.m. The growl returned, low and menacing, vibrating through the walls, through the very air around me. The shadows began to move again, the light from the lamp flickering as if it were being suffocated. The journal, once a source of comfort, now felt like a ticking time bomb, its pages filled with the essence of the darkness, with the curse that had followed me from the hospital. I knew then that there was no escape. The darkness was a part of me now, a shadow that would follow me wherever I went, a constant reminder of the horrors I had uncovered. The nightmare had become my reality, and there was no waking up from it. The only question that remained was how long I could hold out, how long I could keep the darkness at bay before it finally consumed me. As I sat there, the growl growing louder, the shadows closing in, I realized that I was trapped in an endless loop, a cycle of terror and despair that had no end. The darkness was patient, and it would wait as long as it needed to, biding its time until I was too weak, too tired, to resist. And when that time came, when the darkness finally claimed me, there would be no escape, no waking up, no turning back, just the cold, suffocating embrace of the shadows and the endless, echoing growl that would follow me into eternity.